Imagine reaching 67 years old and only then blowing out the candles of your first birthday. A lifetime stolen by rules that turned love into blind obedience and faith into a cage. But when courage defeated fear, the bars shattered, and what she discovered outside will forever change how you see freedom. If I tell you that I celebrated my first birthday at 67 years old, you might think I'm joking. But dear friends, some of us spend our entire lives learning what it means to truly live. The smell of vanilla cake and the warm glow of candles, simple things that most people take for granted, can become the most sacred moments when you've been denied them for decades. Hello, my dear ones. My name is Evelyn Margaret Richardson, and I'm 71 years old now. I was born in 1953 in a small suburb outside Philadelphia, back when the world seemed simpler, but my world was about to become incredibly complicated. Today I want to share with you a story about cages, not the kind made of iron bars, but the kind built with good intentions, religious fervor, and the human need to belong somewhere, anywhere, even when that somewhere slowly steals your soul. Before I begin, I'd love to know where you're watching this from. Leave a comment below and tell me what city, what country you're in. It amazes me how stories can travel across oceans and touch hearts in places I've never been. And if this story speaks to you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. It helps this old grandmother keep sharing the truths that took me decades to discover. The story I'm about to tell you begins in 1965, when I was 12 years old and the world was changing in ways my sheltered life couldn't comprehend. The Beatles were singing about love, families were gathering around television sets to watch the evening news, and children across America were blowing out birthday candles and making wishes. But in my house on Maple Street, the only sounds were the rustling of Watchtower magazines and the quiet, controlled conversations of people who believed they held the only key to salvation. I lived with my mother Eleanor, a woman whose faith was as rigid as her posture, and my younger brother Timothy, who was 9 and already showing signs of the questioning spirit that would eventually get us both in trouble. Our father had left when I was 8, not because he stopped loving us, but because he couldn't breathe in the suffocating atmosphere of absolute religious control that had overtaken our home. My mother had found the truth, that's what Jehovah's Witnesses called their beliefs, in 1961, after a particularly difficult period following my father's departure. 2 well-dressed women had knocked on our door on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying leather book bags and gentle smiles. Sister Margaret Kellerman and Sister Dorothy Hayes. I remember their names because they became more influential in shaping my childhood than any teacher or relative. Mrs. Richardson, Sister Margaret had said, adjusting her modest blue coat against the autumn chill. We're here to share some wonderful news about God's kingdom and how it will solve all of humanity's problems. My mother Eleanor was 34 then, working 2 jobs to keep us fed and clothed, exhausted from carrying burdens that seemed too heavy for one person. The promise of divine solutions to earthly problems must have sounded like the answer to prayers she'd been whispering into her pillow each night. What started as weekly Bible studies in our small living room gradually transformed our entire existence. The colorful Watchtower and Awake magazines began arriving regularly, stacking up on our coffee table like promises of enlightenment. Our modest bookshelf slowly filled with publications that would soon become more authoritative in our home than any other voice, including our own conscience. The first change I noticed was the calendar. My mother took down the cheerful calendar from Murphy's hardware store, the one with pictures of puppies and kittens for each month, and replaced it with a plain one that marked only meeting nights and assembly dates. No birthdays circled in red ink. No Christmas or Easter marked with little stars. Just Tuesday nights for the book study, Thursday nights for the theocratic ministry school, and Sunday mornings for the Watchtower study. From now on, my mother announced one evening as we sat around our small dinner table, the aroma of her famous pot roast filling the kitchen. We're going to live according to God's standards, not the world's false celebrations. I was 13 by then, old enough to understand that something fundamental was shifting, but too young to grasp the full implications. That Christmas of 1966 was the last one I would celebrate for over 5 decades. I remember walking past the Kowalski house next door, where colored lights twinkled in the windows and the sound of laughter drifted through the walls. Mrs. Kowalski was baking her traditional pierogi, and the smell of onions and butter made my mouth water. But when she waved at me through the window and called out, "Merry Christmas, Evelyn!" my mother's hand tightened on my shoulder. "Just smile and wave, honey," she whispered. "But remember, we don't participate in pagan celebrations anymore." Pagan. That word would echo through my thoughts for years to come. Birthday parties were pagan. Christmas was pagan. Easter was pagan. Halloween was definitely pagan. Even saying "bless you" when someone sneezed was discouraged because it had pagan origins. Gradually, our world became divided into two categories: the narrow path of righteousness that we walked, and everything else, which was Satan's territory. The Kingdom Hall became our second home. 3 times a week we'd drive the 10 minutes to that plain rectangular building with no windows and no decorations. Inside, rows of metal chairs faced a simple wooden platform where men in dark suits would deliver talks about the nearness of Armageddon and the importance of maintaining spiritual purity. The walls were painted a forgettable beige, and the only artwork was a simple wooden plaque with the words "God is love," though the love they described often felt more like a contract with very specific terms and conditions. I learned to sit still for 2 hours at a time, to raise my hand and comment on paragraphs from publications I barely understood, to smile at the other families and pretend that this was the most fulfilling life imaginable. The other children seemed to adapt better than I did. Sarah Mitchell, who was my age, would beam during the meetings and eagerly participate in the door-to-door preaching work every Saturday morning. But I found myself staring out the windows during talks, wondering what was happening in the world beyond our insular community. The preaching work, that's what they called it when we went door to door, began when I turned 14. Every Saturday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, I'd meet Sister Hayes at the Kingdom Hall, dressed in a modest skirt that covered my knees, a blouse buttoned to the collar, and carrying my own leather book bag filled with magazines and books designed to convince strangers that their current beliefs were wrong and ours were right. "Good morning," I learned to say at each door, my voice carefully modulated to sound confident and friendly. "We're here to share an encouraging message from the Bible about God's kingdom and how it will bring peace to the earth." Most people were polite, but uninterested. Some were openly hostile. A few invited us in, usually lonely elderly folks who appreciated the company more than the message. But occasionally, we'd find someone like my mother had been, vulnerable, searching, ready to embrace any system that promised certainty in an uncertain world. Those were the ones that troubled my sleep. I'd lie awake thinking about Mrs. Henderson, the widow on Oak Street who'd started studying with us after her husband died. She'd served us tea and homemade cookies while we explained why her husband's soul wasn't immortal and why praying to Mary was wrong. I watched her face crumble as we systematically dismantled beliefs that had comforted her for 70 years, replacing them with new fears about Armageddon and new rules about everything from blood transfusions to birthday cakes. The deeper our family moved into the organization, the more isolated we became from the outside world. My mother stopped visiting her sister Ruth because Ruth celebrated holidays and might be a bad influence. My brother Timothy lost his best friend Jake because Jake's family went to a Baptist church and association with false religion was spiritually dangerous. "But Jake's a good person," Timothy protested one evening after being told he couldn't sleep over at Jake's house anymore. "Satan appears as an angel of light," my mother replied, quoting a verse she'd memorized. "Good people who practice false religion are often the most dangerous because they can lead us away from the truth without us realizing it." I watched my bright, curious little brother's face close down that day. He was 11 years old and already learning that love had conditions, that acceptance had boundaries, that belonging somewhere meant rejecting everywhere else. As for me, I was learning to live in a state of constant vigilance. Every thought had to be examined for traces of worldly thinking. Every friendship had to be evaluated for spiritual safety. Every desire had to be weighed against organizational guidelines. I was 16, the age when most teenagers are discovering who they are, and I was discovering instead who I was not allowed to be. The night that changed everything started like any other Tuesday evening. We'd returned from the book study at the Kingdom Hall, where we'd discussed Chapter 12 of The Truth Shall Make You Free, a book that promised liberation but felt increasingly like a beautifully decorated cage. My mother was in the kitchen making chamomile tea. Timothy was at the dining room table working on his math homework, and I was supposed to be in my room studying for Thursday's Theocratic Ministry School presentation. But instead, I found myself standing at my bedroom window, looking across the street at the Morrison house, where they were having what appeared to be a small birthday party for their daughter Jenny, who was my age. I could see the glow of candles through their kitchen window, hear the faint sound of "Happy Birthday" being sung, watch the family gather around a girl who was laughing with pure, uncomplicated joy. Something deep in my chest ached with a longing I didn't have words for. Not jealousy exactly, but a recognition of something missing, something fundamental that I'd never experienced and was beginning to realize I never would. That's when the first crack appeared in the wall of my faith. It was small, barely visible, but it was there. And once cracks begin, they have a tendency to spread. The crack in my faith's wall started small, but it grew with every meeting, every door we knocked on, every celebration we were forbidden to join. By the time I turned 16, I had become an expert at living two lives: the obedient witness daughter on the outside, and the questioning, hungry soul on the inside that I dared not let anyone see. My mother Eleanor had transformed completely since those early days of Bible studies. The woman who once hummed while cooking breakfast had become someone who scrutinized every aspect of our behavior for signs of worldly contamination. Her auburn hair, once worn loose around her shoulders, was now always pinned back severely. Her dresses, once colorful and fitted, had become uniformly modest and drab. Even her laughter had changed. It was measured now, appropriate, never spontaneous. "Evelyn, dear," she would say each morning as I prepared for school, "remember that you represent Jehovah today. Your classmates are watching to see if we really are different from the world." Being different from the world was exhausting. At Northeast High School, I had learned to navigate the social minefield of being the girl who couldn't participate in anything fun. When my classmates planned birthday parties, I politely declined. When they discussed Christmas presents, I remained silent. When they invited me to school dances, I explained that dancing with boys was inappropriate for unmarried Christians. My English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, a kind woman in her 50s with graying brown hair and gentle eyes, seemed to understand that something was wrong. After class one autumn afternoon, she asked me to stay behind. "Evelyn, I've noticed you never participate in our class celebrations or social activities. Is everything all right at home?" I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Patterson. My family just has different religious beliefs." She nodded slowly, her expression concerned but respectful. "I want you to know that if you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open." That simple offer of unconditional support stayed with me for months. It was so different from the conditional love I experienced at the Kingdom Hall, where acceptance depended on meeting attendance, field service hours, and perfect compliance with organizational rules. At home, my brother Timothy was struggling even more than I was. At 13, he had grown tall and lanky, with our father's dark hair and questioning eyes. Unlike me, he couldn't hide his doubts as effectively. "Why can't we celebrate Mom's birthday?" he asked one evening in March as we sat at the dinner table. "The Bible says to honor your father and mother. Wouldn't celebrating the day she was born be honoring her?" The silence that followed was deafening. My mother set down her fork carefully, her jaw tightening in that way that meant trouble. "Timothy," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "birthdays are pagan celebrations that focus attention on humans instead of Jehovah. The only 2 birthday celebrations mentioned in the Bible resulted in people being killed. Would you want to participate in something that displeases God?" But Timothy, brave, foolish Timothy, wouldn't let it go. "But Mom, lots of things aren't specifically mentioned in the Bible. Cars aren't in the Bible, but we have one. Telephones aren't in the Bible, but we use them. Why are birthdays different?" I watched my mother's face transform, her features hardening into the expression she wore when she was about to deliver spiritual correction. "Young man, you're showing a dangerous spirit of independence. The faithful and discreet slave class has explained these matters thoroughly in our publications. Are you saying you know better than God's earthly organization?" The faithful and discreet slave class. That was their term for the governing body of men in Brooklyn who wrote all our publications and made all our rules. To question them was to question God himself, according to our training. Timothy's shoulders sagged in defeat. At 13, he was learning what I had learned at his age, that questions were dangerous, that doubt was spiritual weakness, that thinking for yourself was the first step toward apostasy. The congregation itself was a carefully constructed ecosystem of surveillance and control. Sister Margaret Kellerman, now our book study conductor, had appointed herself as our family's spiritual overseer. She was a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog every facial expression, every moment of hesitation during meetings. "Sister Richardson," she would say to my mother after meetings, using the formal title that had replaced Eleanor years ago. I noticed that Timothy seemed distracted during tonight's discussion. Perhaps he needs extra help with his personal study? Brother James Morrison, an elder in his 40s with thinning brown hair and a perpetually serious expression, took a special interest in my spiritual development. He was married to Sister Carol Morrison, a quiet woman who rarely spoke above a whisper and always deferred to her husband's opinions. "Sister Evelyn," Brother Morrison said to me one Thursday evening after the Theocratic Ministry School meeting, "You're approaching the age where young sisters sometimes struggle with worldly desires. Your mother and I think it would be beneficial for you to increase your field service hours and perhaps pioneer during the summer." Pioneering meant spending 90 hours per month in door-to-door preaching, essentially a full-time job of trying to convert strangers to our beliefs. For a 16-year-old girl who was already struggling with doubts, the prospect was terrifying. The social dynamics within the congregation were complex and often cruel, though always disguised as spiritual love. Sister Dorothy Hayes, who had been instrumental in converting our family, had become the unofficial enforcer of proper behavior among the women and girls. She was now in her late 50s, with graying blonde hair always perfectly styled and a wardrobe of conservative dresses in muted colors. "Modesty is so important for young Christian women," she would say during our weekly meetings for field service preparation. "Remember, sisters, we want to draw attention to our message, not to ourselves." But her definition of modesty extended far beyond clothing. It encompassed our voices. We should speak softly and never express strong opinions. Our ambitions, we should focus on marriage and supporting our future husbands rather than pursuing careers. Our friendships, we should associate only with other witnesses and view all outsiders as potential threats to our spirituality. The young men in the congregation faced different pressures. Brother David Fletcher, who was 18 and one of the few boys near my age, was being groomed for responsibilities as a ministerial servant. He was tall and serious, with dark hair and the kind of earnest expression that the elders approved of. "The organization needs young brothers who are willing to put kingdom interests first," Brother Morrison told him during one of our circuit assemblies. "Marriage and family are wonderful gifts from Jehovah, but they must never interfere with your service to the organization." I watched David absorb this counsel, seeing how it shaped his interactions with the young sisters in our congregation. We were all potential distractions from his spiritual goals, relationships to be carefully managed rather than naturally developed. The constant pressure to maintain spiritual perfection created an atmosphere where genuine relationships became nearly impossible. We were all performing righteousness rather than living it, competing for approval from elders and older sisters, measuring our worth by our meeting attendance and field service reports. Sister Betty Coleman, a woman in her 30s who had been raised in the organization, had perfected this performance. She gave the most polished comments during Watchtower studies, volunteered for every congregation activity, and always dressed impeccably. But I sometimes caught glimpses of something desperate in her eyes, a hunger that all her spiritual achievements couldn't satisfy. "The key to happiness as a Christian woman," she told me during one of our arranged conversations about spiritual goals, "is learning to find joy in submission to Jehovah's arrangements." But as the months passed, I found myself wondering why joy had to be learned, why submission was required for happiness, why God's love seemed to come with so many conditions and restrictions. My 17th birthday approached in November of 1970, unmarked on any calendar, unacknowledged by anyone in our circle. I woke that morning with the same ache I'd felt watching Jenny Morrison's birthday party years earlier. 17 years of life and not one celebration. Not one moment set aside to acknowledge my existence as precious and worth commemorating. That afternoon, as I walked home from school through the neighborhood where I'd grown up, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Mrs. Henderson, the widow we'd been studying with, had decorations in her window. Not Christmas decorations, but autumn leaves and small pumpkins, simple acknowledgments of the season's beauty. "Hello, Evelyn dear," she called from her front porch as I passed. "How lovely to see you. Would you like some apple cider? I just made a fresh batch." For a moment, I was tempted to accept, to sit on her porch and pretend I was just a normal teenager visiting a kind, elderly neighbor. But the weight of my training held me back. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, but I need to get home for dinner." She nodded, but her smile was tinged with sadness. "Of course, dear. Give my regards to your mother." As I walked away, I realized that Mrs. Henderson had been studying with us for over 2 years, but she still celebrated seasonal changes, still found joy in simple pleasures, still offered hospitality without calculating its spiritual implications. Perhaps she was learning from us, but perhaps we were missing something she had never lost. That evening, as our family sat around the dinner table discussing the upcoming circuit overseer's visit, I found myself studying my mother's face. She was only 39, but she looked older, worn down by years of spiritual vigilance. When had she last smiled spontaneously? When had she last done something simply because it brought her joy? "The circuit overseer will be interviewing each family privately," she was explaining to Timothy and me. "We need to make sure we're prepared to give a good account of our spiritual progress." I nodded appropriately, but inside, something was shifting. The crack in my faith's wall was widening, and through it, I was beginning to glimpse a world where love didn't require performance, where acceptance wasn't conditional, where celebrating life wasn't considered a sin against God. But I wasn't ready yet to step through that crack. The cost of leaving would be everything I'd ever known, everyone I'd ever loved. So I continued to perform my role as the faithful daughter, even as my heart began its slow journey toward freedom. The circuit overseer's visit in the spring of 1971 marked the beginning of the end of my life, as I knew it. Brother Anthony Hendricks arrived at our Kingdom Hall like a spiritual inspector, a man in his 50s with silver-rimmed glasses and an air of absolute authority that made even the local elders seem nervous. He had the power to make or break reputations, to recommend appointments or removals, to determine who was spiritually strong and who needed correction. "Sister Richardson," he said to my mother during their private interview, his voice carrying the weight of organizational authority, "I understand you have 2 teenagers approaching baptism age. The organization is particularly interested in helping young people make their dedication to Jehovah before they're influenced by the world's corrupt attitudes." I was 17, Timothy was 15, and neither of us had expressed any desire to get baptized. But in the Jehovah's Witness organization, children didn't really have choices. They had expectations to meet. That evening, Brother Hendricks requested a special meeting with the young people in our congregation. 6 of us sat in the Kingdom Hall's back schoolroom, facing this man who held our spiritual futures in his hands. David Fletcher was there, now 19 and eager to please. Sarah Mitchell, my childhood peer, sat with perfect posture and an attentive expression. My brother Timothy fidgeted beside me, and I could feel his tension like electricity in the air. "Young friends," Brother Hendricks began, his tone serious but paternal, "you are living in the time of the end. Armageddon could come any day now, and only those who have made a formal dedication to Jehovah through baptism will survive into the new world." He opened his worn Bible to Matthew 24, reading verses about wars and earthquakes and famines that would mark the last days. "Look around you," he continued. "Do you see these signs being fulfilled? The Vietnam War, the social upheaval, the moral decay of this generation, all of these point to the fact that we're living in the final moments of this wicked system." Sarah raised her hand eagerly. "Brother Hendricks, I want to get baptized at the next circuit assembly. I don't want to die at Armageddon." He smiled approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude, Sister Mitchell. Fear of Jehovah is the beginning of wisdom." But when his gaze turned to Timothy and me, his expression became more scrutinizing. "Sister Evelyn, You'll be 18 soon. In the world, that's considered adult age. But in God's organization, spiritual maturity is measured by our willingness to make a public declaration of our faith. What's holding you back? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for an answer that would reveal whether I was spiritually strong or spiritually weak, whether I was good association or potential bad association. I want to make sure I understand everything completely before I make such an important decision, I said carefully, using the language I'd been taught was appropriate for expressing any hesitation. Brother Hendricks nodded, but his eyes remained cold. Understanding comes through study and application, Sister Evelyn. But more importantly, it comes through faith and obedience. Sometimes young people think too much and feel too little. The heart that's truly touched by Jehovah's love doesn't hesitate to respond. After the meeting, my mother was waiting in the car, her face tight with embarrassment. The drive home was silent, except for the sound of rain against the windshield and the rhythmic swish of the wipers. When we arrived at our house, she turned to face me and Timothy in the back seat. I was humiliated tonight, she said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. Brother Hendricks asked me why my children weren't baptized yet. He said that faithful parents usually have faithful children who are eager to serve Jehovah. The implication was clear. Our hesitation reflected poorly on her spiritual condition and parenting abilities. In the congregation's social hierarchy, a mother whose children weren't progressing spiritually was seen as failing in her primary responsibility. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said, meaning it. I truly didn't want to cause her pain or embarrassment, but I also couldn't bring myself to make a commitment that felt increasingly hollow. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified from multiple directions. Sister Kellerman began scheduling more frequent visits to our home, bringing publications specifically designed for young people considering baptism. Brother Morrison arranged for David Fletcher to spend time with Timothy, hoping that association with a spiritually strong young brother would influence him positively. "Timothy needs better friends," I overheard Brother Morrison telling my mother after a Tuesday book study. "That boy Jake from school is clearly having a negative influence. Maybe it's time to consider homeschooling." The thought of Timothy being even more isolated from normal teenage experiences made my chest tight with anger. Jake was a good kid, kind, funny, interested in science and baseball and all the things that healthy 15-year-old boys should care about. But in the organization's worldview, those normal interests were distractions from spiritual matters. My own friendships at school had become increasingly difficult to maintain. Jenny Morrison, the neighbor girl whose birthday party I'd watched through my window years earlier, had been trying to include me in her social circle despite my repeated refusals to participate in their activities. "Evelyn, we're going to see Love Story at the Majestic Theater on Friday," she said one afternoon as we walked home from school. "My mom said she could pick you up if you want to come." Movies were another area of careful consideration for witnesses. We were supposed to avoid anything with violence, sexual content, or spiritistic themes. Most mainstream movies fell into one of these categories, making cinema attendance rare and highly supervised. "I'll have to ask my mother," I said, knowing what the answer would be. Jenny's face fell slightly. We'd been through this routine dozens of times over the years. "You know, Evelyn, I've been wondering, are you happy? I mean, really happy with all these restrictions?" The question caught me off guard. No one had ever asked me directly about my emotional state, about whether the life I was living brought me joy. In the organization, happiness was assumed to come from spiritual activities, and questioning that assumption was discouraged. "Of course I'm happy," I said automatically. "I have the truth about God and His purposes. That's more valuable than any worldly entertainment." But even as I spoke the words, they felt foreign in my mouth, like lines from a play I'd memorized, but never truly understood. That night, I lay in bed thinking about Jenny's question. Was I happy? When I tried to remember the last time I'd felt genuine joy, not the manufactured enthusiasm of Kingdom Hall meetings, but real, spontaneous delight, I had to reach back to childhood memories from before we became witnesses, playing in the sprinklers during summer afternoons, baking cookies with my mother when she still hummed while she worked, Christmas morning excitement that felt magical and pure. All of those memories came from the time my mother now referred to as our worldly period, the dark years before we found the truth. But if those had been dark years, why did they glow so brightly in my memory? The turning point came in June of 1971, just after my high school graduation. The ceremony itself had been a source of tension. Many witnesses discouraged participation in graduation exercises because of their supposedly pagan origins and because they might encourage pride and ambition. But my mother had compromised, allowing me to attend but not to participate in any after-parties or celebrations. As I walked across the stage in my cap and gown to receive my diploma, I felt a mixture of accomplishment and sadness. Mrs. Patterson, my English teacher, squeezed my hand as she handed me the certificate. "I'm so proud of you, Evelyn," she whispered. "You have such potential. I hope you'll consider continuing your education." College was another forbidden territory for most witnesses. Higher education was viewed as dangerous to faith, likely to expose young people to evolutionary theories and worldly philosophy that could corrupt their thinking. The organization taught that the time left before Armageddon was too short to justify 4 years of secular study. But Mrs. Patterson's words planted a seed. What if I had potential beyond door-to-door preaching and eventually becoming a housewife and mother? What if there were parts of myself that I'd never been allowed to explore? That summer, as the pressure for baptism reached a crescendo, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I got a job at Morrison's Five and Dime, a local department store where I could earn money while supposedly working towards spiritual goals. My manager was Mrs. Helen Novak, a woman in her 40s with kind brown eyes and a practical approach to life. She treated me with a professional respect I'd never experienced before. My opinions mattered, my ideas were valued, my contributions were appreciated without constant evaluation of my spiritual condition. "Evelyn, you're a natural at customer service," she told me after my first week. "You really listen to people and try to help them find what they need. That's a gift. A gift. Not a spiritual quality to be directed toward theocratic goals, just a natural human ability that could be appreciated for its own sake." The concept was revolutionary to me. Working in the outside world exposed me to people the organization had taught me to view as spiritually dead, walking in darkness, controlled by Satan. But what I found instead were ordinary human beings dealing with ordinary human problems. Parents trying to make their children happy, elderly people shopping for gifts for grandchildren, teenagers saving money for things they wanted. Mr. Giuseppe Antonelli, a regular customer in his 70s, would come in every Tuesday to buy small gifts for his wife, who was in a nursing home with dementia. "She doesn't remember me anymore," he told me one afternoon as I wrapped a small bottle of lavender perfume, "but she still smiles when I bring her something pretty." His devotion to his wife, his weekly ritual of love in the face of heartbreak, seemed more genuinely spiritual than anything I'd witnessed in the Kingdom Hall. Yet, according to my training, he was part of Satan's world, someone to be pitied and potentially converted rather than admired. One evening in August, as Timothy and I walked home from a meeting where we'd again been counseled about our lack of baptismal progress, he stopped abruptly in the middle of the sidewalk. "Evelyn," he said, his voice cracking with adolescent emotion and something deeper. "I can't do this anymore. I don't believe it. I don't believe any of it." The words hung between us in the humid summer air. To say such things aloud was dangerous. They bordered on apostasy, the ultimate sin in the organization's hierarchy of wrongdoing. But looking at my brother's face, seeing the pain and confusion there, I realized he was simply voicing what I'd been feeling for months. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "I mean, I don't think God cares whether we celebrate birthdays. I don't think he's going to destroy everyone who isn't a witness. I don't think the men in Brooklyn know any more about God than anyone else, and I'm tired of pretending I do." We stood there for a long moment, two teenagers on the threshold of a decision that would change everything. In the distance, I could hear the sound of children playing in the Kowalskis' backyard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze like a memory of what childhood should sound like. "If we don't get baptized," I said quietly, "Mom will be devastated. The congregation will think we're rebelling. They might even disfellowship us eventually for our attitude." "And if we do get baptized?" Timothy asked. Then we're trapped forever. You know what happens to people who get baptized and then try to leave. I did know. I'd seen it happen to Brother Michael Torres, a young man who'd been baptized at 16 and then developed doubts in his early 20s. When he stopped attending meetings and started dating a non-witness girl, he'd been disfellowshipped, formally expelled from the congregation with the instruction that all faithful witnesses must shun him completely. His own parents were forbidden to speak to him except in cases of absolute necessity. The choice before us was stark: commit to a life we increasingly doubted, or face the loss of everyone we'd ever known and loved. As we resumed walking toward home, where our mother waited with her expectations and her fears and her absolute certainty that we were choosing between life and death, I felt something shifting inside me. The crack in the wall of my faith had become a chasm, and I was standing on the edge, looking across to a world I'd been taught to fear, but was beginning to recognize as possibly, maybe perhaps, the place where I actually belonged. But crossing that chasm would require a kind of courage I wasn't sure I possessed. It would mean breaking my mother's heart, losing my community, facing an uncertain future with no support system and no roadmap for how to live as a normal human being. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into sleep, I made a decision that would set everything else in motion. I wouldn't get baptized. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And whatever consequences came from that choice, I would face them. The die was cast. The only question now was when it would land and what would be destroyed in the process. 2 weeks later, the circuit assembly arrived, a 3-day gathering of congregations from our circuit that would culminate in a mass baptism ceremony. The assembly hall buzzed with excitement as families prepared their teenagers for this most important spiritual milestone. The theme that weekend was walking in the truth, and every talk seemed designed to emphasize the urgency of formal dedication to Jehovah. Brother Hendricks delivered the keynote address on Friday evening. "Young ones," he proclaimed from the platform, his voice echoing through the packed auditorium, "delay is dangerous in these last days. Every day you postpone baptism is another day you remain outside of God's protective organization." I sat between my mother and Timothy in our assigned seats, watching as dozens of young people nodded along enthusiastically. Some were as young as 10 or 11, children who could barely understand the commitment they were making, but who had been pressured by parents desperate to see their offspring safely within the organization's protective embrace. During the lunch break on Saturday, Sister Kellerman approached our family with news that made my mother's face light up with hope. "Sister Richardson, I've been speaking with Brother Morrison about Evelyn and Timothy. We've arranged for them to meet with the circuit overseer this afternoon for special encouragement about baptism. There are still openings for tomorrow's ceremony." My heart began racing. Private meetings with circuit overseers were serious business. They could result in either enthusiastic approval or spiritual marking that would follow you for years. "Oh, that's wonderful," my mother said, clasping her hands together. "This is just what they need. Counsel from someone with more experience and spiritual maturity." Timothy and I exchanged glances. We both understood that this meeting was essentially a spiritual interrogation designed to break down our resistance and push us toward baptism. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, we found ourselves in a small office behind the assembly hall's main auditorium. Brother Hendricks sat behind a metal desk, Brother Morrison beside him taking notes. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their faces, and the air smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and nervous perspiration. "Evelyn, Timothy," Brother Hendricks began, consulting a folder that apparently contained reports about our spiritual condition. "Your mother and the elders in your congregation are concerned about your spiritual progress. At your ages, most young people raised in the truth have already made their dedication to Jehovah." He paused, letting the implied criticism sink in. In the organization's culture, being behind schedule spiritually was a form of failure that reflected poorly not just on us, but on our family's faithfulness. "Now, I want to understand what's causing this delay. Are there specific doctrinal questions you need help with? Are there personal weaknesses you're struggling with? Or perhaps there are bad associations that are influencing your thinking?" The questions were loaded with assumptions about what kinds of problems could cause young witnesses to hesitate about baptism. Doubt wasn't presented as a normal part of spiritual development. It was framed as either ignorance, moral weakness, or contamination from worldly influences. Timothy, braver than I was, spoke first. Brother Hendricks, I've been reading the Bible on my own, and some things don't seem to match what we teach. Like about birthdays. Jesus had followers who celebrated things, and the Bible doesn't really forbid celebrating someone's birth. Brother Morrison leaned forward, his expression stern. Timothy, this is exactly the kind of independent thinking that leads to spiritual shipwreck. The faithful and discreet slave class has carefully examined all these matters and provided us with proper understanding. Are you saying you know better than God's earthly organization? I'm not saying I know better, Timothy replied, his voice steady despite the intimidating atmosphere. I'm just saying, I don't understand why we can't discuss these things openly. If the truth is really true, shouldn't it be able to handle questions? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Brother Hendricks closed Timothy's folder and fixed him with a stare that would have made many adults uncomfortable. Young man, you're displaying a dangerous spirit of pride and rebellion. The Bible warns against this kind of attitude in the last days, that people would become lovers of themselves, not open to any agreement, having a form of godly devotion, but proving false to its power. He turned to me. Evelyn, are you being influenced by your brother's thinking? Because I can see from your field service reports that your hours have been declining, and your meeting attendance has become irregular. This was news to me. I hadn't realized that our spiritual activities were being monitored and recorded in such detail. The idea that my every movement was being tracked and evaluated felt invasive and controlling in a way I was only beginning to recognize. I've been working at Morrison's 5 and Dime, I said. Sometimes my schedule conflicts with meetings. Working where? Brother Morrison's pen stopped moving across his notepad. Morrison's 5 and Dime, the department store downtown. The two men exchanged meaningful looks. Apparently, this was also problematic information that hadn't reached their ears. Sister Evelyn, Brother Hendricks said, his tone becoming increasingly severe. Are you aware that working closely with worldly people can be spiritually dangerous? That association with those who don't share our values can gradually weaken our resolve to serve Jehovah. My manager is very kind, I said. She respects my beliefs and accommodates my meeting schedule when possible. Kindness from worldly people is often Satan's way of making his system appear attractive, he replied. Remember, he disguises himself as an angel of light. The fact that you're being treated well at this job might actually be evidence that it's spiritually harmful. The circular logic was dizzying. If worldly people were mean to us, it proved they were under Satan's influence. If they were kind to us, it also proved they were under Satan's influence. There was no possible evidence that could contradict their predetermined conclusion. Brother Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying both Timothy and me with calculating eyes. I think what we're seeing here is a classic case of worldly contamination. These young people have been allowed too much freedom, too much exposure to independent thinking, too much association with those outside the organization. He turned to address us directly. Let me be very clear about something. If you choose not to get baptized, if you continue down this path of questioning and doubt, there will be consequences. You may think you can remain on the fence indefinitely, but that's not how God's organization works. What kind of consequences? Timothy asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Well, for starters, you won't be considered good association for the young people in the congregation who are making spiritual progress. You'll find yourselves increasingly isolated from the only friends you've ever known. Your families standing in the congregation will suffer, and eventually, if your attitude becomes too negative, we may have to take steps to protect the congregation from your influence. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. We were being told that continued doubt would result in social exile, family shame, and eventual formal shunning, even without being baptized first. But more importantly, Brother Hendricks added, his voice taking on the dramatic tone reserved for the most serious spiritual warnings, you need to consider your eternal future. Armageddon is coming soon, perhaps within the next few years. Only those who have made a dedication to Jehovah and are actively serving in his organization will survive. Is your pride really worth eternal destruction? We left that meeting in stunned silence. The walk back to the main assembly hall felt surreal, like moving through a dream where familiar surroundings had become threatening and strange. All around us, families were chatting happily about the spiritual program. Children were playing games during the break. Teenagers were flirting awkwardly under their parents' watchful eyes. Normal cult life was proceeding as if we hadn't just been given an ultimatum that would determine the course of our entire existence. That evening, as we drove home from the assembly, my mother's silence was more oppressive than any lecture could have been. I could see her hands gripping the steering wheel, her jaw set in the determined expression she wore when she was trying not to cry. Finally, as we pulled into our driveway, she turned to face us. In the dim light from the street lamp, her face looked older than her 40 years, worn down by the constant pressure of raising children in an organization that demanded perfection. "I failed you," she said quietly. "I failed you both, and I failed Jehovah. I should have been stronger, should have protected you from worldly influences, should have made sure you understood how serious these matters are." "Mom, you didn't fail us," I started to say, but she held up her hand. "No, Evelyn. Brother Hendricks made it clear that your attitudes reflect my spiritual condition. If I had been the mother I should have been, you would both be eager to serve Jehovah instead of questioning his organization." She was crying now, quiet tears that made her look fragile and defeated. "I'm going to have to make some changes. No more job at the store, no more association with school friends. We're going to focus completely on spiritual matters until you both come to your senses." That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I realized that the crisis I'd been dreading for months had finally arrived. The organization had drawn its line in the sand, my mother had chosen her side, and Timothy and I were being forced to make a choice that would determine not just our immediate future, but our entire adult lives. Through my bedroom window, I could see the lights in the Morrison house across the street, where Jenny lived her normal teenage life, free to make mistakes and learn from them, free to explore her interests and develop her own beliefs, free to celebrate the simple fact of her existence whenever she chose. I was 18 years old, legally an adult but emotionally still a child, trained from infancy to defer to organizational authority, taught that independence was selfish and dangerous, conditioned to believe that my own thoughts and feelings were unreliable guides to truth and happiness. But something had changed during that meeting with Brother Hendricks and Brother Morrison. Their threats and manipulations had revealed something I'd never seen so clearly before. This wasn't about serving God or finding truth, or even about living a moral life. This was about control, pure and simple. Control over our minds, our relationships, our daily activities, our deepest beliefs about ourselves and our place in the world. And for the first time in my life, I found myself thinking a thought that would have horrified me just months earlier. Maybe being controlled wasn't the same thing as being loved. Maybe being protected wasn't the same thing as being imprisoned. Maybe losing everything I'd ever known was preferable to staying in a cage, even a beautiful cage decorated with promises of eternal life. The decision was crystallizing, becoming inevitable, but making it would require a kind of courage I wasn't sure I possessed. The courage to disappoint my mother, to face an uncertain future, to learn how to live as a free human being when freedom was the one thing I'd never been taught to value or pursue. Tomorrow, I would have to decide whether to submit to baptism and seal my fate as a lifetime member of God's organization, or to choose a path that would lead me into uncharted territory where the only guide would be my own conscience and the only safety net would be my own strength. I fell asleep that night with my future hanging in the balance, knowing that whatever I chose would change everything and that there would be no going back. Sunday morning arrived gray and humid, matching the weight in my chest as I dressed for what might be my last assembly as an active Jehovah's Witness. The baptism ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock, and my mother had already laid out the white dress she'd bought weeks ago in hopeful preparation for this day. "Evelyn, honey," she called from downstairs, her voice artificially bright with forced optimism. "I made your favorite pancakes. You'll need strength for today." I stared at my reflection in the bedroom mirror, seeing an 18-year-old girl who looked younger than her years, still carrying the uncertainty and fear that had marked my entire adolescence. In a few hours, I would either walk into that baptismal pool and surrender my freedom forever, or I would make a choice that would shatter my mother's world and exile me from the only community I'd ever known. Timothy knocked softly on my door. "Evelyn, can I come in?" He entered looking as conflicted as I felt, his usually confident demeanor replaced by the uncertain shuffle of someone facing an impossible decision. At 15, he was still legally a child, but the organization considered him old enough to make a commitment that would govern his entire adult life. "I can't do it," he said simply, sitting on the edge of my bed. "I thought maybe I could go through with it to make Mom happy, but I can't lie in front of all those people. I can't promise to serve an organization I don't believe in." His words hit me like a physical blow, not because they surprised me, but because they voiced exactly what I'd been thinking. The relief of hearing someone else speak my doubts aloud was immediately followed by terror at what his decision would mean for our family. "Timothy, if you don't get baptized today, after everything that's happened, they'll view it as open rebellion. Mom will be humiliated in front of the entire circuit." "I know," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But if I do get baptized, I'll be trapped. And eventually, when I can't pretend anymore, it'll be even worse. At least this way, I'm being honest." Downstairs, we could hear our mother moving around the kitchen, humming one of the kingdom songs under her breath, something she only did when she was trying to maintain her composure. The sound of her forced cheerfulness made my heart ache. We arrived at the assembly hall at noon, 2 hours before the baptism ceremony. The building buzzed with excited families preparing for their children's dedication to Jehovah. Mothers fussed over their teenagers' appearance, fathers offered last-minute spiritual counsel, and the baptismal candidates themselves displayed various degrees of enthusiasm and nervousness. Brother Morrison approached our family as we found our seats in the section reserved for baptismal families. His smile was carefully controlled, revealing nothing of yesterday's confrontational meeting. "Sister Richardson," he said to my mother, "are Evelyn and Timothy prepared for this afternoon's ceremony? Have they confirmed their decision to dedicate their lives to Jehovah?" The moment had arrived. No more delays, no more discussions, no more hoping that somehow we could avoid making a definitive choice. My mother turned to look at Timothy and me, her eyes bright with expectation and barely contained anxiety. Timothy cleared his throat, and I could see his hands trembling slightly. When he spoke, his voice was steady but quiet, forcing everyone to lean in to hear him. "Brother Morrison, I've thought about it very carefully, and I don't think I'm ready for baptism yet. I still have questions about some of the teachings, and I want to make sure I fully understand everything before I make such an important commitment." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Brother Morrison's smile froze, then slowly faded into an expression of stern disapproval. My mother's face went pale, then flushed red with embarrassment and shock. "Timothy," she whispered, "what are you saying? We discussed this. You know how important this is." "I know, Mom. But I can't promise to serve something I'm not sure about. That wouldn't be honest, would it?" Brother Morrison's jaw tightened. "Young man, this is exactly what Brother Hendricks warned us about yesterday. You're allowing pride and independent thinking to interfere with your relationship with Jehovah." All eyes turned to me. The weight of their expectation felt crushing, like being buried under layers of guilt and obligation and conditional love. My mother's face was a portrait of desperation. Her entire identity as a faithful witness mother hung on this moment. For several seconds I couldn't speak. The words I needed to say were there, waiting, but voicing them would cross a line from which there would be no return. I thought about the past 6 years since we'd become witnesses, about all the birthdays I'd missed, all the friendships I'd sacrificed, all the parts of myself I'd suppressed in service to an organization that claimed to speak for God. I thought about Mrs. Patterson, my English teacher, who had offered unconditional support without demanding anything in return. About Mrs. Novak at the store, who valued my contributions simply because they were mine. About Jenny Morrison, who had asked me if I was happy, a question that had haunted me for months because I couldn't honestly answer yes. "I'm not ready either," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I need more time to study and understand what this commitment really means." The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, other families continued their preparations, unaware that our small group had just experienced a spiritual earthquake. But in our section, the atmosphere was thick with shock and disappointment. My mother's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down her face as she realized that both of her children, her only children, had just publicly rejected the most important decision in a witness's life. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "How could you humiliate me like this in front of everyone? After everything I've sacrificed for you both, everything I've given up to raise you in the truth." Her pain was genuine and devastating. I wanted to take back my words, to tell her I'd changed my mind, to spare her the embarrassment and heartbreak that were clearly crushing her. But I also knew that giving in now would mean spending the rest of my life living someone else's version of truth. Brother Morrison stood up, his face grim with the kind of righteous anger that organization men displayed when their authority was challenged. "Sister Richardson, I think it's best if you take your children home. We'll need to schedule a meeting with the elders to discuss this situation and determine what steps need to be taken." The threat was clear. Timothy and I had just marked ourselves as spiritually dangerous, potential apostates whose influence needed to be contained. Our refusal to get baptized wasn't just a personal decision. It was viewed as rebellion against God's earthly organization. As we gathered our things to leave, I caught sight of David Fletcher across the auditorium. He was standing with a group of young men who would be getting baptized that afternoon, their faces glowing with the enthusiasm I'd never been able to genuinely feel. When he saw us leaving early, his expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked like pity. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. My mother cried silently, occasionally wiping her eyes with tissues she'd pulled from her purse. Timothy stared out the window, his jaw set with determination that couldn't quite hide the fear underneath. And I sat in the back seat, watching the familiar neighborhoods pass by, wondering if I'd just made the bravest or the most foolish decision of my life. When we arrived home, my mother went straight to her bedroom and closed the door. Through the thin walls, we could hear her sobbing, deep, wrenching sounds that spoke of dreams destroyed and hopes shattered. She had invested everything in raising faithful children who would serve Jehovah forever, and we had just demonstrated that her efforts had failed. Timothy and I sat in the living room, surrounded by the Watchtower publications that had shaped our entire worldview, listening to our mother's grief and facing the reality of what we'd done. There would be consequences, immediate and long-term consequences that we were only beginning to understand. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Timothy asked, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. I looked around our modest living room, at the family photos that showed us at circuit assemblies and congregation picnics, at the bookshelf filled with organization literature, at the absence of any birthday pictures or Christmas memories or evidence that we'd ever celebrated the simple fact of being alive. "I don't know if it was right," I said honestly, "but I know it was honest. And maybe that's enough for now." Outside, I could hear the sounds of normal life continuing. Children playing in yards, lawnmowers running, families enjoying their Sunday afternoon without the weight of organizational expectations and spiritual obligations. For the first time in my life, I was no longer part of God's chosen people, no longer protected by His earthly organization, no longer guaranteed survival at Armageddon. I was just Evelyn Richardson, 18 years old, with no idea how to live as a free human being, but determined to learn. The cage door was open, and despite my terror of the unknown world beyond, I was finally ready to step through it. The consequences of our decision began immediately. By Monday evening, Brother Morrison had called to schedule a meeting with the elders for Thursday night, not to discuss our spiritual progress, but to address what they termed our rebellious attitude and its potential effect on other young people in the congregation. My mother had barely spoken to Timothy and me since Sunday. She moved through the house like a ghost, performing her daily routines with mechanical precision, but avoiding eye contact with her children who had brought such shame upon her. The silence was more devastating than any angry words could have been. Tuesday morning brought our first taste of the social consequences. When I arrived at the Kingdom Hall for the weekly book study, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Sister Kellerman greeted me with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sister Evelyn," she said, her voice carefully modulated, "perhaps you and Timothy should sit in the back tonight. We want to make sure the comments from spiritually mature ones take precedence." It was a subtle but unmistakable demotion. In the organization's social hierarchy, those who showed spiritual weakness were gradually moved away from positions of prominence. We were being quarantined, our potential contamination carefully contained. During the meeting, I noticed how other families positioned themselves. The Mitchells, whose daughter Sarah had been baptized the previous Sunday, sat prominently in the front row, basking in the approval that came with having a faithful child. The Fletchers made sure their son David wasn't sitting near us, protecting him from our negative influence. After the meeting, as families lingered to socialize, I found myself increasingly isolated. Conversation stopped when I approached, and parents guided their teenagers away from Timothy and me with subtle but unmistakable gestures. "Evelyn," Sister Hayes approached me near the coat closet, her expression concerned but wary. "Your mother is going through such a difficult time. Perhaps you should consider how your choices are affecting her health and spiritual well-being." The message was clear. Our decision wasn't just about us. We were causing spiritual harm to others, particularly to the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise us in the truth. The guilt was carefully applied, designed to make us reconsider our position. Wednesday brought news that made the situation even more complex. Mrs. Novak called me at home to inform me that several customers had complained about my employment at Morrison's Five and Dime. Apparently, word had spread through the local witness community that I was working closely with worldly people, and faithful witnesses were being encouraged to shop elsewhere. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," she said, her voice genuinely regretful. "You're a wonderful employee, but I can't afford to lose customers over this controversy. I'm going to have to let you go." The irony was bitter. The job that had given me my first taste of normal social interaction, that had shown me there was a world beyond the Kingdom Hall where people could be kind without ulterior motives, was now another casualty of our decision to think for ourselves. That evening, my mother finally broke her silence. She sat Timothy and me down at the kitchen table, her face haggard from days of crying and sleepless nights. "I've been thinking about what Brother Morrison said," she began, her voice hoarse with emotion, "about how my spiritual condition has obviously influenced your attitudes. Maybe I haven't been the mother I should have been." She paused, struggling to maintain her composure. "So I've made a decision. If you're going to continue questioning the organization, if you're going to persist in this rebellious spirit, then you need to understand the full consequences of that choice." My heart began racing. I could sense that whatever she was about to say would change everything. "Starting this weekend, if you haven't changed your minds about baptism, you'll need to find somewhere else to live. I can't have my home become a place where apostasy is tolerated. It wouldn't be fair to the congregation, and it wouldn't be right before Jehovah." The words hit me like a physical blow. At 18, I was legally an adult, but I had no savings, no job, no experience living independently, and no support system outside the organization. Timothy, at 15, was still a minor, but apparently my mother was willing to choose her religious community over her own children. "Mom," Timothy said, his voice cracking, "where are we supposed to go? We don't have any family outside the organization. We don't have any friends who aren't witnesses." "That's something you should have considered before you decided to reject Jehovah's arrangement," she replied, her tone hardening with the kind of righteous resolve that the organization cultivated in its members. "There are consequences for every choice, and these are the consequences for yours." Thursday night's elder meeting was a formal affair held in the Kingdom Hall's back room after the regular theocratic ministry school meeting. Brother Morrison was there, along with Brother Phillips, the presiding overseer, and Brother Hendricks, the circuit overseer who had remained in town specifically for this meeting. Timothy and I sat across from 3 middle-aged men who held the power to determine our future within the organization, and by extension, our relationship with our mother and every friend we'd ever known. "Young people," Brother Phillips began, consulting notes that had obviously been prepared in advance. "We're here tonight because your recent behavior has shown a pattern of spiritual rebellion that concerns us greatly." He outlined our offenses in clinical detail: my declining meeting attendance, my association with worldly people at work, Timothy's questioning of organizational teachings, and most seriously, our public refusal to get baptized after receiving direct encouragement from the circuit overseer. This attitude represents more than personal immaturity, Brother Hendricks interjected. It represents a spirit of independence that can spread to other young people in the congregation. We have a responsibility to protect the flock from influences that could undermine their faith. The meeting lasted 2 hours. We were questioned about our beliefs, our associations, our future intentions. Every answer we gave was examined for evidence of apostasy. Every hesitation was interpreted as confirmation of our spiritual danger. Finally, Brother Morrison delivered their decision. While you haven't been baptized, so we can't disfellowship you in the technical sense, we are marking you as bad association. The congregation will be advised to limit their contact with you to what's absolutely necessary. Parents will be encouraged to protect their children from your influence. It was spiritual exile without the formal procedure. We were being expelled from the only community we'd ever known, but in a way that allowed the organization to claim they were being merciful since we weren't actually baptized members. There is still hope for you, Brother Phillips added, his tone suggesting that hope was rapidly diminishing. If you humble yourselves, accept correction, and demonstrate genuine repentance through increased meeting attendance and field service participation, this situation can be reversed. But we all understood that genuine repentance meant abandoning our questions, suppressing our doubts, and submitting to baptism despite our reservations. It meant choosing organizational loyalty over personal integrity. That weekend, true to her word, my mother helped us pack our belongings into cardboard boxes and garbage bags. She cried as she did it, but her resolve never wavered. The organization had trained her well. Loyalty to Jehovah's earthly arrangement took precedence over natural family affection. "I love you both," she said, as we carried our possessions to Timothy's friend Jake's father's pickup truck. Jake's family had offered us temporary shelter when they learned what was happening. "But I love Jehovah more. When you come to your senses, when you're ready to return to the truth, I'll be here waiting." As we drove away from the house on Maple Street where I'd spent my teenage years, I looked back to see my mother standing in the doorway, watching her children disappear into the worldly darkness she'd spent years trying to protect us from. That night, sleeping on an air mattress in the Kowalski's basement, Jake's family name was actually Kowalski, our old neighbors who had always shown kindness despite our religious differences. I lay awake thinking about the price of freedom. In less than a week, we'd lost our home, our community, our mother's love, and any semblance of security we'd ever known. But we'd also gained something that seemed increasingly precious: the right to think our own thoughts, ask our own questions, and make our own choices about what to believe and how to live. We were terrified, uncertain, and completely unprepared for the challenges ahead, but we were finally genuinely free. The girl who had never celebrated a birthday, never questioned organizational authority, never imagined life beyond the Kingdom Hall, was gone forever. In her place was a young woman who would have to learn everything about living as a normal human being, starting with the radical concept that her own conscience was a reliable guide to truth and morality. It would be a long and difficult education, but it had finally begun. 49 years have passed since that terrifying night in the Kowalski's basement, and I'm writing these words as a 71-year-old woman who has lived more authentic life in the decades since leaving than in all the years I spent trapped in organizational thinking. The first few years of freedom were the hardest. Timothy and I had to learn everything from scratch: how to make friends based on genuine compatibility rather than shared doctrine, how to celebrate holidays without feeling guilty, how to trust our own judgment when making moral decisions. Simple things that most people take for granted became monumental challenges for two young people who had never been allowed to think for themselves. I remember my first Christmas in 1972, spent with the Kowalski family, who had become our surrogate parents. Mrs. Kowalski had asked if I wanted to help decorate their tree, and I stood frozen in their living room, staring at the colorful lights and ornaments, terrified that participating would somehow damn my soul to eternal destruction. "It's just a tree, honey," she said gently, placing a silver star in my trembling hands. "It's about love and family and celebrating the good things in life. There's nothing evil about joy." That silver star was the first Christmas decoration I ever hung, and as I placed it on the tree, something inside me that had been frozen for years began to thaw. The sky didn't fall, lightning didn't strike, and God didn't seem angry at all. Instead, I felt something I'd rarely experienced in the Kingdom Hall: simple, uncomplicated happiness. Timothy adapted more quickly than I did. His questioning nature, which had gotten us into so much trouble with the elders, served him well in the outside world. He finished high school, earned a scholarship to study engineering, and built a successful career designing bridges, a profession that seemed fitting for someone who had learned to help people cross from one place to another. My path was different. I took my GED, enrolled in community college, and discovered that I had a passion for literature and writing. Mrs. A. Patterson, my high school English teacher who had offered support all those years ago, became a mentor who helped me understand that asking questions wasn't dangerous. It was how human beings grew and learned and became fully themselves. In 1975, I met Robert Chen, a kind man 3 years older than me who worked as a social worker, helping young people transition out of difficult family situations. He understood what it meant to rebuild your life from nothing, having immigrated to America from Taiwan as a teenager with parents who struggled to accept his American friends and values. "You know what I love about you, Evelyn," he told me on our first date, as we sat in a diner sharing pie and talking about our complicated relationships with family expectations. "You think about everything so carefully. Most people just accept what they're told, but you actually examine ideas to see if they make sense." The quality that had made me spiritually dangerous in the organization made me attractive to a man who valued intelligence and independence. We married in 1977, in a small ceremony attended by the chosen family we'd built from friends and mentors who loved us for who we were, not who they thought we should become. Robert and I never had biological children, but we became foster parents to 12 young people over the years, many of them teenagers who had been expelled from strict religious families for being gay, questioning doctrine, or simply thinking differently than their parents expected. Our home became a haven for kids who needed to learn the same lessons Timothy and I had learned: that love shouldn't be conditional, that questions aren't dangerous, and that there are many ways to live a meaningful life. My mother never spoke to us again. She died in 1998, having maintained her loyalty to the organization until the end. Brother Morrison, who conducted her funeral service, mentioned during his talk that she had remained faithful despite the heartbreak of having children who chose the world over Jehovah. Even in death, we were used as an example of the consequences of leaving the truth. But I learned something important in the years after her passing. Grief for the mother I'd lost was complicated by relief that I no longer had to hope for a reconciliation that would never come. She had chosen her version of truth over her children, and while that choice brought her the approval of her religious community, it also meant she never met her daughter-in-law, never held foster grandchildren, never saw the good lives her children built after leaving her faith. Timothy married a wonderful woman named Linda in 1982, and they raised 2 daughters who grew up celebrating birthdays with elaborate parties, questioning everything their parents told them, and choosing their own paths based on their own values and interests. Watching my nieces experience the childhood freedom that Timothy and I never had was healing in ways I hadn't expected. The moment that inspired this story happened 4 years ago, on my 67th birthday. I had been out of the organization for nearly 5 decades, had celebrated dozens of birthdays by then, but something felt different about turning 67. Maybe it was the recognition that I was approaching the same age my mother had been when she died. Or maybe it was simply the weight of all those missed celebrations from my youth. Timothy, now a successful engineer with grandchildren of his own, arrived at my house that evening carrying something I hadn't expected: a small white cake with 2 candles, exactly like the one described in the story I'd been working on about my childhood. "I was thinking today about all the birthdays we never had," he said, setting the cake on my kitchen table. "And I realized we can't go back and change the past, but we can honor the woman who had the courage to choose freedom over security." As I blew out those candles, I thought about the 18-year-old girl who had been so terrified of disappointing her mother, so afraid of being alone, so convinced that questioning authority was spiritual weakness. She couldn't have imagined the life that lay ahead, the education, the career as a freelance writer, the marriage to a man who encouraged her independence, the foster children who became beloved family, the deep friendships built on mutual respect rather than shared doctrine. Today, I volunteer with a support group for people leaving high-control religious organizations. Every month, I meet men and women of all ages who are facing the same impossible choice Timothy and I faced in 1971: stay and slowly die spiritually, or leave and lose everyone they've ever loved. The hardest part, I tell them, isn't losing the people who loved you conditionally. The hardest part is learning to trust yourself, to believe that your thoughts and feelings and questions are valid, to understand that freedom is worth the price you pay for it. Some of them make the choice to leave. Others decide to stay and find ways to live authentically within their restrictions. I've learned not to judge either decision. Everyone has to find their own path to whatever peace they can achieve. But for those who choose freedom, I try to offer what the Kowalskis offered Timothy and me all those years ago: a safe place to land, unconditional acceptance, and the radical idea that they deserve to be loved for exactly who they are, not who someone else thinks they should become. This story is my gift to anyone who has ever felt trapped by other people's definitions of truth, righteousness, and acceptable living. Your questions aren't dangerous. Your doubts aren't spiritual weakness. Your desire for authentic relationships and genuine joy isn't selfish or worldly. You are allowed to think your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, and choose your own path based on your own conscience and understanding. You are allowed to celebrate your existence, to mark the passage of time with gratitude and joy, to find meaning in simple pleasures like birthday cake and Christmas lights, and the laughter of people who love you without conditions. The cage door is always open, my dear friends. The only question is whether you're ready to step through it into the terrifying, beautiful uncertainty of freedom. If you are, know that you're not alone. There are those of us who have walked this path before, and we're here to remind you that choosing authenticity over approval, questions over certainty, and love over fear is always, always worth it. This is a real story shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you'd like to share, write in the comments. We would be very happy to tell your story on our channel.